Welcome back to On the Move with Victor Shi. It is Friday, May 12th, 2023, and today we are going to be talking about the Supreme Court and one aspect of it that doesn't get the attention it quite deserves, and that is this thing called the shadow docket. This is a term that was first coined in 2015 by University of Chicago law professor William Bode and has increasingly become relevant and in many cases concerning given how many rulings the Supreme Court is making beyond the traditional merits docket and instead on the shadow docket. So today we're going to talk about what more exactly that means and the rapid increase of the use of the shadow docket in recent years and what to do about it. And to help me do that, I am joined by Steve Vladeck, law professor at University of Texas, Austin, who is out with a new book coming out next Tuesday called The Shadow Docket, How the Supreme Court Uses Its Stealth Rulings to Amass Power and Undermine the Republic. It's a book I know will be essential reading for so many people and anyone who cares about the legal system and democracy more broadly. So Steve, it's so great to see you. Thanks so much for joining me this morning.
Oh, Victor, thanks for having me.
So, unless you follow the Supreme Court closely, you probably haven't heard of the shadow docket before. So I'm wondering, for those of us who may not follow the Supreme Court that closely, start off by explaining maybe what the shadow docket is and how it came to be.
Yeah, I mean, so it's really just this descriptive term. It's not any sort of fancy idea. And when Will Bode coined it in 2015, he was using it basically to describe an umbrella of rulings that the Supreme Court hands down other than the 60-ish, what we call merits decisions, other than the big fancy decisions we get every May and June after a case has gone all the way through the legal system and has been argued in the Supreme Court and, is decided. So many of these rulings are banal or anodyne. A lot of them have to do with which cases the court is agreeing to hear or not hear, granting or denying certiorari. But Will's insight, which I've sort of rather shamelessly appropriated, is that a lot of really important stuff happens through these unsigned and usually unexplained orders, and that we ought to pay more attention to what the court is doing in the shadows because oftentimes those rulings can have just as significant effects on all of us and even on the law as the stuff we usually pay attention to, the big fancy rulings on the merits docket.
So I think as I was reading about this, one of the most important things about the Supreme Court is that, whether you like the outcome of a case or not, at least through the traditional merits docket, they show their process and they have to back their assertions up with facts and evidence and real arguments. But as I understand with the shadow docket, it's basically just a ruling without any explanation. Is that correct?
It's usually correct. I mean, so there are rare cases where the court will write a short opinion, maybe explaining one of these. But yeah, the norm is for orders, which is what most of these are, to be unsigned and unexplained. So not only do we not know why the court did what it did, we don't even know what the vote count was in many of these contexts.
Oh, wow.
And, I think, Victor, we don't care when the order in question is giving a party more time to file a brief or is turning away a clearly meritless appeal. But one of the things that's really happened in the last 6 or 7 years and what really motivated me to write this book was that we've seen a remarkable expansion in how the court is using unsigned, unexplained orders, especially on what are known as emergency applications, right, to adjust the status quo to a degree and in ways that we had never seen before. And that's part of why I wanted to write the book, was to put into context, especially for folks who don't follow the court that carefully, what the Supreme Court's doing today and how that stacks up against what the court has done historically.
So I want to get into some specific examples later, but you mentioned the merits docket and then we have the shadow docket. Are there different procedures or standards for a case going down the shadow docket compared to the merits docket?
Yeah, I mean, everything is different. The weirdest part is there actually aren't even that many formalized procedures for the shadow docket. Anyway, so I think it would help if we broke the shadow docket down into two principal subcategories.
Sure.
The normal part of the shadow docket is certiorari, is all of the sort of fighting over which cases the court's going to take up. The Supreme Court has almost complete control over its docket. It can pick and choose which cases it wants to hear. It can pick and choose which issues it wants to hear within the cases it chooses to hear. So that part, right, I think is typically pretty well understood. The procedures for that are pretty well known. It happens behind closed doors, but there's a familiarity with the practices. Then there's what is often called the emergency docket, right? So while a case is working its way to the Supreme Court, some party comes to the justices and asks for some kind of interim relief. A good recent example of this in the Mifepristone case, right after a federal judge in Texas was going to basically block the FDA's approval of mifepristone, the Biden administration asked the Supreme Court to freeze that ruling, not reversing it, not ending the case, but while that case worked its way all the way up to the Supreme Court so that it wouldn't go into effect. That's a stay. And stays are a pretty common part of the shadow docket. There's a standard that the court is supposed to follow in granting or denying a stay. But, Victor, when the typical order, like the one in the mifepristone case, doesn't explain itself, right? We have no analysis to assess of whether we actually think that this was an appropriate case for that kind of relief.
So you mentioned that the number of cases on the shadow docket is increasing pretty significantly. Can you give us any statistics on how that number has changed over the past couple of years and whether or not the nature of the cases have changed as well?
Yeah, I mean, both are true, and it's really true on the emergency docket side of the shadow docket. So in the 2000s and in the early 2010s, the Supreme Court would grant somewhere between 6 to 10 emergency applications each term. And Victor, most of those were in death penalty cases. Most of those were 11th hour stays of execution, or in some cases, unstaying lower court stays of execution, where the implications in that particular case were significant, but we weren't talking about nationwide or even statewide policies. What shifts starting in about 2016, 2017 is two things. One, we start seeing a lot more grants. So by 2019, 2020, we're seeing 22, 24 grants per term, more than double, right, what we had seen previously. But two, the nature of the grants, where the Supreme Court's interventions are allowing President Trump to carry out nationwide immigration policies, or they're blocking statewide COVID restrictions, right? Or they're blocking the OSHA vaccination mandate for COVID, or they're allowing into effect Texas's 6-week abortion ban, right? These are rulings that are much more impactful on the ground and that have much broader sort of real world and legal effects than even the interventions that we had seen in the past, which tended to be limited to individual death penalty cases.
I mean, do you think the increase in these applications is there any way to kind of punt it to any other court, or does the Supreme Court have to take up these increased applications?
I mean, the court doesn't have to do anything. One of the things I teach my federal court students is the expression power versus discretion. Right. When you don't know an answer in my class, the answer is, can the Supreme Court do it? Yes. Will the Supreme Court do it? Probably not. Right. So the Supreme Court is supposed to go last. And what's weird about the emergency docket is it is a context in which the justices are being asked to go very, very early, if not first. I mean, look at the student loan cases, right? So the student loan cases, when they came to the court, they came as emergency applications from the Biden administration when there had been no trials in the lower courts, right? When there had not even been a merits decision in the Nebraska case, the 6 red state case. And so one of the things that's happening is the justices are, they're stepping in at a much earlier stage when they don't have to. And, Victor, maybe one response, right, is, litigation in the lower courts has shifted profoundly in recent years. The justices are simply responding to this new phenomenon. The problem is, right, that the response is not symmetrical, right? And so, the neutral principles that might explain why the court is being more aggressive, why the court is stepping in earlier, don't hold up when you look at the whole body of cases. So what we see instead is the court is very aggressive when it's about protecting a Republican president's policies, but not a Democratic president. The court is very aggressive when it's about blocking blue state COVID mitigation measures, but not red state COVID mitigation measures. And, that's really problematic because if there were principled reasons why the court's behavior in these otherwise similarly looking cases was varying, we're not getting them. And so, you don't have to think the justices are acting in bad faith, but just the lack of explanation really exacerbates charges that what this really is just politics by judges.
Yeah. And it hurts, I would imagine, the Supreme Court's perception of legitimacy, which is, I think, that at the end of the day, what matters a lot to the Supreme Court. And you've also seen a lot of Supreme Court justices, or maybe not a lot, but a few Supreme Court justices like Elena Kagan, who have been vocally critical about this shadow docket. I'm wondering if Chief Justice John Roberts, you think, is aware of this and is willing to do something about it, if at all?
I mean, so I think he's clearly aware of it. I mean, so one of the
Yeah.
things that the book talks about is there are a number of cases starting as soon as Justice Barrett is confirmed. And so as soon as John Roberts is no longer the median,
Right.
where Roberts actually joins the Democratic appointees in dissent, where, it's 5-4 with Roberts and, first Breyer, Sotomayor, Kagan, now Kagan, Sotomayor, Jackson, right, on the other side. And what you see in those cases is actually a progression where at first he's dissenting, but he's writing separately. And then there's this remarkable April 2022 case where he joins Justice Kagan's dissent that accused the majority of taking procedural shortcuts. So, one of the things I think is really remarkable about these cases is you can often see fissures and divisions and sort of how do I say, even maybe a little bit more honesty from the justices in what's happening on the shadow docket and what's happening on the merits docket. And I think John Roberts is part of that story.
Very interesting. Well, is there any way forward with this? I mean, does this have to come from within the court? Does Congress have a role to play with this? I mean, what is kind of the way to address what's happening right now with the shadow docket?
I mean, all of the above. So I will say that I think the first and most important step is more public awareness. So conversations like this, I think, are a big part of that. I wrote the book, hopefully, to move that needle.
Yes.
We've seen already the court actually respond in some respects to what's been happening to some of these critiques. I actually think Justice Barrett, for example, has moderated her behavior a fair amount since the aftermath of the SB 8 Texas abortion decision in September of 2021. So, I think public awareness and public understanding is itself actually a really important first step because that exerts pressure on the justices to behave better. The court can, and I think already has, toned down its aggressiveness on the shadow docket. The Mifepristone case, I think, is a really good example of this, where only Justices Alito and Thomas publicly dissented. Right? I think that's, we haven't seen as much intervention this term as we've seen in previous ones. But I also think that the court can commit to, writing something, to providing a rationale in any case where it's going to upset the apple cart, in any case where it's going to grant emergency relief. As for Congress, and this is probably a good way to tie the whole threads together, I think actually, I mean, obviously so much of what we're talking about when we talk about the court right now is ethics. And like, Justice Thomas and, who paid for what. And I actually think that the ethics conversation and the shadow docket conversation are very similar because they're both about the same problem, which is that Congress has stopped checking the court. Right? They're symptoms of the same disease. And so there are lots of specific things Congress can do, I think, to rein in some of the court's behavior on the shadow docket. The book proposes some of them. But honestly, Victor, I just want Congress to remember that part of its job is to oversee the court in the first place. And that, for 200 years, the court and Congress were involved in this really, I think, dynamic back and forth interbranch dialogue about the court's docket, about what the justices should do, about their behavior. And that has totally fallen by the wayside. And I think that's a big culprit for a lot of the problems we're seeing with today's court.
Absolutely. Well, we could have this conversation for so much longer, but I want everyone to read your upcoming book, The Shadow Docket, How the Supreme Court Uses Stealth Rulings to Amass Power and Undermine the Republic, which is out next week. Steve, thank you so much for all that you're doing to shed light on this court and your analysis. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thanks for having me, Victor. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thanks so much. Well, that was a chilling episode with Professor Steve Vladeck from the University of Texas, Austin. Again, be sure to check out his book, which comes out next week, The Shadow Docket, How the Supreme Court Uses Stealth Rulings to Amass Power and Undermine the Republic. I suspect it's going to be a great book, and I will get my hands on it very soon. So check that book out, because this really is one of those things that I don't think a lot of people really quite know about, and for good reason, because a lot of what happens with the Supreme Court seems like it happens, behind closed doors. I mean, just think about oral arguments. They're only kind of broadcast through a listening communication. They aren't visual. We can't see what happens, what goes on inside the courtroom. And so right now, I think there's a lot of things about the Supreme Court that is concerning, especially just like Professor Vladeck said, there are a lot of conversations right now about ethics, about ethical concerns. And this shadow docket really kind of ties right into that. And I think all of us should be paying attention. Anyone who cares about our institutions, our legal system, our democracy, the rule of law, should check out Steve's work and Steve's new book, which comes out again next week. Thank you, Steve, for joining me for this episode today. Just a couple of things before I let you all go. Yesterday, there was some interesting news that E. Jean Carroll is now actively weighing about whether or not she's going to come forward with a new defamation lawsuit after Donald Trump's CNN town hall on Wednesday. He called her, of course, a bunch of names and attacked her. And it seems like Robbie Kaplan, her lawyer, and E. Jean Carroll are pursuing possible new defamation claims. I mean, this is, she said in the New York Times, it's just stupid. It's just disgusting, vile, foul. It wounds people. And she added that she's been insulted by better people. And her lawyer said, we will come to a decision in a next day or so, probably. So whatever happens, we'll be following that. And no matter what happens, I support E. Jean Carroll. She has shown us, all of us, what it looks like to stand up to a bully. And so thank you, E. Jean, for all that you do. And no one should have to be subject to that. And just kind of, once again, I mean, CNN, knowing that this would happen, asking a question about E. Jean Carroll, they knew that Donald Trump would attack her, and yet they still asked him that question. And it's just, and then the audience laughed and applauded what he said, which is just one of those low moments in American media and American politics. And just yet another reminder why we can't rely on the media to solve our problems. But, E. Jean Carroll is pushing forward at full steam ahead. She's not allowing Donald Trump to tear her down, which is quite amazing. So thank you, E. Jean. Just one more thing that really stuck out to me yesterday. There is one Republican candidate running for president who you might not have heard of, and I'm going to butcher his name, but Vivek Ramaswamy apparently is this person's name. He is a 37-year-old former businessman, entrepreneur. And the other day, he said that he would want to amend the Constitution to raise the voting age to 25 years old. Now, you can vote under 25 years old, but only if you pass a civics test, or you join the military, or you become a first responder. I mean, this is a modern day civic literacy test. You have to wonder, first of all, what's on that civics test? Why he wants to do this, why he wants to do it is because he knows that Gen Z and young people are more diverse, more educated than ever before. They are voting increasingly for Democrats for good reason, because you have Republican policies like this that don't even try to meet Gen Zers, but instead want to try to raise the voting age to 25. I mean, it's just insane what Republicans are doing. Their effort to silence us, to suppress our vote, is happening in broad daylight. I mean, this is a literal policy platform that is on Vivek's website for the people to see. I mean, if anyone wants to wonder, what is happening with this Republican Party, just pay attention to their words, pay attention to what they say to you. This is someone who, he's not polling so well, but he is also running for president, and he's not the only Republican who has suggested the possibility of raising the voting age. A lot of other people have suggested raising the voting age to 21. He wants to raise the voting age to 25. So it's just kind of on its face so absurd. And the fact that we're in this era where you're trying to make your kind of citizens pass civics tests in order to vote. I mean, that harkens back to literacy tests back during the Jim Crow era. I mean, this is so, in my opinion, unconstitutional. And it seems like he's getting a lot of bad slack for it, which is good. We have to call this stuff out, because this is what the Republican Party has become. They're not a party that is willing to engage in good faith with democracy, with your vote. They want to try to silence anyone who doesn't agree with them or who poses a threat to their ability to stay in power. And we have to call them out for it. Otherwise, these things, democracy dies in darkness, and we have to shed a light on these things. And to Vivek, I mean, it's not going to work. And this is what the Republican Party stands in. And it's up to all of us to really take that at face value and then to do everything we can to vote them out in 2024. So that's the news I'll leave you with on this Friday, knowing that this is what the Republican Party is, but knowing also the power that we all have in this effort. And I thank all of you for tuning in every day right here on youtube.com/Politicon as we talk about and navigate this crazy news. So thank you all for watching this episode with Professor Steve Vladeck, and check out his book, which comes out next week. I will be back next week with more episodes of On the Move with some exciting guests. We'll be back, just a quick programming note, every next Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, We'll be gone Thursday, but we'll be back on Friday. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday next week, we'll be right here on youtube.com/Politicon at 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern. Again, right here. Be sure to like and subscribe and share the episode with anyone who you might find interesting. Anyone who wants to learn more about politics, about the law, about the culture and politics that surround Gen Z, share this with them. Be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss our episodes, which stream live every day. Again, I'm grateful for all of you and your voice and your tuning in. But again, this is only the first step. Go out there, tell your friends, make some change, make some phone calls, volunteer. This is only the first step, and I'm grateful. I will see you all next week. Have a great rest of your Friday and have a great rest of your weekend.